Imagine this. It's a cold, rainy evening. The kind of night that makes you grateful for a warm cup of tea and a cozy blanket. But for one pregnant woman named Sarah, there was no warmth, no comfort, just a broken-down car, a dead phone, and a street full of people who didn't seem to notice her shivering in the rain. She waved at passing cars, hoping someone would stop. But no one did. People hurried past, lost in their own world as she stood there, soaked and desperate. Now, let's be honest, how many times have we walked past someone in need, assuming they'd figure it out on their own? Maybe we've told ourselves, someone else will help. But here's where things take a turn. Just when Sarah was losing hope, an elderly woman named Margaret stepped in. And what she did next? Well, it's the kind of kindness that doesn't just change one life. It creates a ripple effect that lasts for generations. This story isn't just about a rainy night. It's about the power of a simple good deed, a reminder that no matter how small an act of kindness may seem, it can make a world of difference. So, sit back, relax, and let's dive into a heartwarming tale that proves kindness never gets old. And hey, if you love stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It was the kind of night that made people quicken their steps, pulling their coats tighter around them as the wind howled through the empty streets. Rain poured relentlessly from the sky, drumming against the pavement and turning the roads into glistening rivers. Streetlights flickered in the storm, casting eerie reflections on the wet asphalt. Sarah stood alone on the sidewalk, her arms wrapped around her swollen belly, her thin coat already drenched from the downpour. The cold bit through her clothes, making her shiver uncontrollably as she tried to shield herself from the merciless rain. She had left work late, exhausted and eager to get home, but fate had other plans. Her car had sputtered and died just a few blocks away, and when she reached for her phone, she found the battery completely drained. A dead car, a dead phone, and now, a storm that showed no mercy. She had hoped that maybe someone would stop, maybe someone would notice her standing there, helpless and shivering, but the world was moving too fast to care. A car sped past, sending a wave of icy water splashing over her legs. She gasped at the shock but clenched her jaw, refusing to cry. Another car approached, and she raised her hand, waving desperately, but the headlights only flashed past as the driver continued on without a second glance. A young couple walked by under a large umbrella, their laughter ringing through the air as if the storm didn't exist for them. Sarah took a step forward, her voice catching in her throat as she tried to call out, but they were already gone. It was as if she were invisible, a ghost standing on the edge of a city that had no time for people like her. The rain dripped from her hair, running down her face like silent tears. She glanced down at her belly, gently cradling it as she whispered, "We'll be okay, baby. We just have to hold on." But even as she spoke, doubt crept into her heart. Desperation clawed at her as she spotted a small convenience store a few feet away. The neon sign flickered, casting an unsteady glow on the rain-soaked pavement. Hope surged within her as she stumbled toward the entrance, her shoes slipping on the wet ground. She reached for the handle, but before she could step inside, a man in a stained apron appeared in the doorway, blocking her path. His face was blank, his eyes void of sympathy as he glanced at her dripping clothes. Without a word, he pointed to a small sign taped to the window, "No loitering." Sarah's stomach twisted. "Please," she started, her voice hoarse, but the man shook his head and closed the door. The lock clicked into place. She staggered back, the rejection stinging worse than the cold. A sharp gust of wind whipped through the street, and she instinctively wrapped her arms around herself, as if she could somehow protect both herself and the life growing inside her. She had never felt so alone. The city, with all its towering buildings and endless streets, had never seemed as vast and unforgiving as it did in that moment. She thought of her husband, probably pacing at home, wondering why she hadn't called. He would be worried sick, but there was no way to reach him. The thought of spending the night out here, exposed to the elements, sent a new wave of fear through her. She took a shaky breath and forced herself to think. Maybe she could walk to the nearest bus stop, but she had no idea how far it was, and every step felt like a battle against the storm. Her legs were tired, her back ached, and the weight of the baby inside her made movement slow and painful. Another car approached, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Summoning the last of her strength, she stepped forward, waving both hands. The car slowed for just a second, and hope flared in her chest, only to be extinguished when the driver hit the gas and sped away. The rush of wind and water left her trembling. Sarah let out a ragged breath, her vision blurring with exhaustion and frustration. Was this it? Was this how the world worked now? Had kindness disappeared? Just as the last sliver of hope threatened to slip away, a soft voice broke through the storm. "Dear, you're going to catch your death out here." The words, spoken with gentle concern, sent a shiver down Sarah's spine, but this time, not from the cold. She turned slowly, blinking against the rain, and saw an elderly woman standing just a few feet away, holding a large umbrella that shielded her from the downpour. The woman's face was lined with age, her silver hair tucked neatly under a scarf. Her eyes, though old, were warm and filled with something Sarah hadn't seen all night: genuine care. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. Strangers weren't always kind. Life had taught her that. But there was something about this woman, something steady and familiar, like a memory she had forgotten but still carried deep within her. The woman stepped closer, extending the umbrella over Sarah, shielding her from the storm. "Come inside, child," she said, nodding toward the small bakery behind her. "Let's get you dry." Sarah bit her lip, glancing at the warmly lit interior of the bakery. Through the glass window, she could see rows of freshly baked bread and pastries lining the shelves, the soft golden light casting a glow over everything. The rain continued to pour down, relentless and cold. She knew she didn't have many choices. Shivering, she nodded and allowed the woman to guide her inside. The moment she stepped through the door, warmth wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. The scent of cinnamon and vanilla filled the air, a stark contrast to the bitter chill outside. The woman closed the umbrella and set it by the door before turning back to Sarah. "Let me get you a towel, dear." Sarah stood there awkwardly, dripping water onto the checkered floor. The bakery was small but cozy, with wooden shelves stocked with loaves of bread, croissants, and cookies. A small counter sat in the back, where a cash register hummed quietly and a kettle whistled softly from a corner. She realized then that they were alone. There were no other customers, no other workers. Just her and this woman. The woman returned with a thick towel and draped it over Sarah's shoulders. "You poor thing," she murmured, her voice filled with genuine concern. "You're drenched. And in your condition, oh, we can't have that." Sarah pulled the towel closer, sighing as the warmth seeped into her frozen skin. "Thank you," she said softly. I didn't know what to do. My car broke down, my phone died, and no one would stop." Her voice cracked slightly, the exhaustion and fear of the evening catching up to her. "I thought I'd have to sleep on the street." The woman shook her head, clucking her tongue disapprovingly. "It's a shame how the world is now. People are always in such a rush, so caught up in their own lives that they don't see who needs help." She turned and poured a cup of tea, handing it to Sarah. "This will warm you up." Sarah hesitated for only a second before accepting the cup. She wrapped her fingers around it, relishing the heat as steam curled upward, carrying the scent of chamomile and honey. She took a tentative sip, and a warmth unlike any other spread through her, soothing and calming. The woman settled into a chair across from her, studying her with kind, knowing eyes. "What's your name, dear?" "Sarah." "Beautiful name." "I'm Margaret." Sarah nodded, taking another sip. For the first time that night, she felt safe. "Thank you for helping me." Margaret waved a hand dismissively. "No thanks needed. Just a little kindness. We all need it sometimes." Sarah exhaled deeply, staring into her tea. I thought someone would stop. Even just to ask if I was okay. But everyone just kept walking, kept driving. Like I was invisible." Margaret's eyes softened. "You're not invisible, child. The world just moves fast and people forget to look. But that doesn't mean kindness is gone. It's still here. You just have to find it." Sarah looked up then, really looking at Margaret. The wrinkles on her face told a story, one of years lived, of hardships endured, of wisdom gained. There was a gentle strength in her, something steady and unwavering, like a lighthouse in the middle of a storm. Margaret reached for a plate and placed a warm croissant in front of Sarah. "You need your strength." Sarah hesitated, then took a bite. The buttery, flaky pastry melted in her mouth, and for the first time that night, she felt something close to comfort. Margaret smiled. "You remind me of my daughter when she was expecting. She was always strong, always trying to handle things on her own." A shadow crossed her face, a flicker of something sad and distant. "She passed some years ago. Cancer." Sarah's breath caught. "I'm so sorry." Margaret nodded slowly. "It was hard. Losing a child it's something no mother should go through. But she left behind a little boy, my grandson. And every time I look at him, I see her." She smiled, but it was tinged with pain. Kindness keeps her memory alive. Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. She had spent the entire night thinking the world was cold and uncaring, but here was this woman, this stranger, who had suffered, who had lost, and yet still chose to be kind. Margaret patted Sarah's hand. "You're going to be a wonderful mother. I can tell." Sarah let out a small, shaky laugh. "I hope so. I'm terrified." Margaret squeezed her hand gently. "That's how you know you'll be good at it. The best mothers are the ones who worry if they're doing it right." The clock on the wall chimed softly, and Sarah suddenly remembered her husband. I should call my husband. He must be worried sick." Margaret nodded and handed her an old-fashioned rotary phone. Sarah dialed the number, her fingers trembling slightly. The moment her husband picked up, his frantic voice filled the receiver. "Sarah? Oh my God, where are you? I've been looking everywhere." Tears pricked her eyes. "I'm okay. I'm at a bakery. A kind woman helped me. I'm coming right now." Margaret smiled knowingly as Sarah hung up. "See? You were never alone, child." Sarah wiped at her tears, overwhelmed by gratitude. But Margaret simply shook her head. "No need for words. Just promise me one thing." Sarah swallowed hard, nodding. "When you see someone in need, be the one who stops." Sarah gripped Margaret's hand tightly. "I promise." Margaret smiled, but there was something deeper in her eyes, something that told Sarah this wasn't just an empty request. It was a story, a history, a moment of pain that had shaped the woman standing before her. Sarah wanted to ask, to understand why this act of kindness mattered so much, but before she could find the words, Margaret turned away and gestured toward the open door of the bakery. The scent of warm bread and cinnamon curled through the air, and Sarah felt her body finally relax as she stepped inside. The world outside was still drenched in rain, cold and unwelcoming, but in here, there was warmth, not just from the oven but from the quiet hum of something deeper, something that felt like home. Margaret pulled out a chair and motioned for Sarah to sit. "Let me get you something warm, dear." Sarah sat, pressing her hands against her belly, feeling the flutter of movement beneath her ribs. She had been so tense, so worried, that she hadn't even noticed how tired she was. It had been hours since she'd last eaten, and the weight of the day pressed heavy on her shoulders. She looked around the small bakery, wooden shelves lined with golden brown loaves, delicate pastries dusted with sugar, a single flickering candle on the counter where an old register sat. It wasn't a big place, wasn't a fancy cafe or a bustling restaurant, but it was lived in. A place where people came for more than just food. Margaret returned with a cup of tea and a thick slice of warm bread, butter melting into its soft surface. "Child, you need your strength." Sarah took the cup, wrapping her fingers around the warmth. The first sip sent heat through her chest, chasing away the chill of the rain that still clung to her skin. "Thank you," she murmured, but Margaret only smiled as if she'd been expecting nothing in return. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the soft tapping of rain against the window. Then Margaret sighed, her gaze drifting toward the storm outside. "You remind me of my daughter," she said softly. Sarah looked up. "You have a daughter?" "I did." Margaret's voice didn't waver, but there was something in the way she said it, something final, something that made Sarah's throat tighten. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. Margaret gave a small nod, as if she had heard those words 1,000 times before. She was kind like you, always looking out for others. But the world, she exhaled slowly, the world isn't always kind in return. Sarah didn't know what to say, so she simply listened. Margaret stared into the tea in her hands, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. When my daughter was pregnant with my first grandchild, she was in a car accident. She was stranded on the side of the road in the middle of the night. It was raining, just like tonight. Her voice caught, but she swallowed hard and pushed through. She was hurt. Not badly at first, but enough that she needed help. She called for someone, anyone, but people kept driving past. No one stopped. Sarah's breath hitched, her heart squeezing painfully in her chest. She tried to walk. Thought she could make it to the nearest gas station. But she collapsed. The baby, Margaret's voice broke then, just for a moment. She closed her eyes, steadying herself. By the time someone finally stopped, it was too late. Sarah covered her mouth, horror washing over her. Margaret looked at her then, her eyes filled with something raw and unfiltered. I was angry for a long time. At the world. At the people who didn't stop. At the ones who kept driving, who looked the other way. But anger doesn't change the past. It doesn't bring back what you've lost. She reached across the table and covered Sarah's hand with her own. So instead, I decided that I would never be one of those people. I would never look away. I would never let someone stand in the rain, afraid and alone, while I had the power to help. Sarah blinked back tears, squeezing Margaret's hand tightly. That's why I stopped for you, Margaret continued. Because once upon a time, I hoped, prayed, that someone would stop for my daughter. Her voice softened, eyes glistening. But no one did. Sarah couldn't hold back her tears anymore. They slid down her cheeks, hot and heavy, mixing with the warmth of the tea she had barely touched. She thought of all the people who had passed her by tonight, the ones who had turned away, the ones who had been too busy, too distracted, too indifferent. And she thought of Margaret's daughter, alone in the rain, waiting for a kindness that never came. I'm so sorry, Sarah whispered again, but Margaret simply patted her hand. Don't be, child. Just remember, kindness isn't about grand gestures. It's not about who deserves it or who doesn't. It's about stopping. Just stopping when the world tells you to keep walking. Sarah nodded, wiping her tears away. She wouldn't forget. She couldn't. Margaret stood, smoothing her apron. Come on now. Let's get you warm and then get you home. Sarah followed her lead, her heart heavy yet somehow lighter at the same time. She had walked into this bakery as a stranger in the rain. But she would walk out carrying a promise she intended to keep. The moment she stepped inside, warmth wrapped around her like a long-lost friend. The scent of cinnamon, nutmeg, and freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling with the faint hum of an old radio playing a soft tune from decades past. The small shop had a rustic charm, wooden shelves stacked with loaves of bread, glass cases filled with pastries that glistened under the dim lighting, and a small corner with a few mismatched chairs where customers could sit and enjoy a warm drink. It was a place untouched by time, a hidden gem in the middle of a city that had long since traded kindness for indifference. Margaret guided Sarah to a wooden chair near the counter, her frail hands surprisingly strong as she helped her settle in. Stay here, child. Let me get you something warm, she said before disappearing behind the counter. Sarah sat there, still shivering, though she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the overwhelming relief that flooded her. After a long night of being ignored, abandoned, and left to fend for herself, someone had finally stopped. Someone had finally cared. A moment later, Margaret returned with a towel and a steaming cup of tea. Drink this, she urged, pressing the warm cup into Sarah's hands. It'll take the chill off. Sarah hesitated, the gesture feeling almost foreign. She had grown so used to people brushing past her, their heads down, their hearts closed, that she had forgotten what kindness felt like. Slowly, she took a sip, the warmth spreading through her like a gentle embrace. The tea had hints of honey and chamomile, soothing her frayed nerves. Margaret pulled up a chair and sat across from her, watching her with eyes filled with something Sarah couldn't quite place. It wasn't pity. It wasn't curiosity. It was understanding. You remind me of my daughter when she was expecting, she said softly, the words carrying a weight that made Sarah look up. She always worried about the world, about whether it would be kind to her baby. I used to tell her the world can be cruel, but there will always be good people. You just have to find them. Sarah blinked back tears, her fingers tightening around the cup. No one stopped for me tonight, she whispered, the pain of the evening pressing against her chest. Not one person. Margaret sighed, shaking her head. People are busy. They rush through life, always thinking about the next thing, never stopping to see who's standing right in front of them. She paused, her gaze drifting to the window where the rain continued to fall. But not all of them are bad. Some just don't know how to help. And some are just waiting for a reason to remember they still have kindness left in them. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. And you? Why did you stop? Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that held a lifetime of stories. Because I know what it feels like to stand in the rain, alone and afraid. She exhaled, as if releasing a memory she had carried for far too long. I was young once, not much older than you. I was pregnant, scared, and had no place to go. It was winter, the streets were covered in ice, and I had nowhere to turn. People walked past me, their coats pulled tight, their eyes fixed ahead. No one saw me. No one cared. She paused, shaking her head. Or at least, that's what I thought. Sarah leaned in, captivated. Margaret's voice had taken on a distant quality, as if she was stepping back in time. I had given up, Margaret continued. I remember thinking, this is it. This is how my baby and I will be forgotten. And then, just when I was ready to accept that no one would help me, a woman stopped. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with silver hair and the warmest eyes I had ever seen. She didn't ask me why I was out there. She didn't ask what I had done wrong or if I had made mistakes. She just reached out, took my frozen hands in hers and said, "Come inside, dear. Let's get you warm." Margaret laughed softly, the memory still fresh in her mind. That one act of kindness changed everything. She took me in, gave me a warm meal, let me sleep on her couch. And the next day, she helped me find a place to stay. She didn't owe me anything. She had nothing to gain. But she did it anyway. Because that's what kindness is. It's giving without expecting. Loving without conditions. Sarah felt the tears spill over before she could stop them. The story felt too close, too real. It wasn't just a tale from the past. It was her own reality, unfolding in a different time, with different people, but the same desperate need for someone to care. Margaret reached across the table, taking Sarah's hand in hers. "That woman saved me," she said, squeezing gently. "And I swore that night that if I ever saw someone standing in the rain, alone and afraid, I would be the one who stopped. Because kindness, my dear, isn't just a moment. It's a legacy." Sarah stared at her, the words sinking deep into her heart. A legacy. That was what true kindness was. It didn't stop with one person. It was meant to be carried forward, passed from one hand to another, like a flame lighting the darkness. Margaret patted her hand before standing up. "Come on, let's get you home." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but the words never came. She could see it in Margaret's eyes. This wasn't a burden for her. This was a gift. And Sarah would accept it, not just for herself, but for the promise she now carried in her heart. The promise to one day be the one who stops, who reaches out, who reminds the world that kindness still exists. As she followed Margaret out into the night, the rain had lessened, and the cold didn't feel quite so bitter. Because now, she wasn't just a woman stranded in the storm. She was something more. She was a part of a legacy, a chain of kindness that had started long before her and would continue long after. And she vowed, right then and there, that when the time came, she would do the same for someone else. Because the world could be cruel, yes. But as long as there were people like Margaret, and as long as she carried this promise, kindness would never die. Margaret took a deep breath, her gaze distant as if she were looking through time itself. The bakery, warm and fragrant, seemed to quiet around them, as if even the walls wanted to listen. "You see, dear," Margaret began, wrapping her hands around a cup of tea, "I wasn't always the one offering help. Once, I was the one who needed it. And if it hadn't been for the kindness of a stranger, I don't know where I'd be today." Sarah leaned in, her heart beating a little faster. She had felt so alone just moments ago, stranded in the rain, convinced that no one cared. But now, she was realizing that pain, loneliness, and desperation weren't hers alone. They were part of life, a thread woven into the fabric of so many people's stories. And here was Margaret, willing to unravel her own past, to let Sarah see that she wasn't alone after all. Margaret sighed, taking a small sip of her tea before continuing. "I was barely 20 when I found myself in a situation much like yours. It was winter, one of the coldest we'd had in years. My husband had just left, packed his things in the middle of the night and never looked back. I was 5 months pregnant, alone, and scared out of my mind. We had been renting a tiny apartment, barely big enough for the two of us, let alone a baby. And when he left, so did the rent money." She shook her head, the memory so vivid it seemed to age her right before Sarah's eyes. "I tried everything to make ends meet. I worked long hours at a diner, but the paycheck wasn't enough. Soon, the landlord came knocking, demanding payment I didn't have. I begged for time, pleaded for mercy. But the world isn't always merciful, dear. I was given a week to leave. A week. Can you imagine?" She let out a hollow laugh, but there was no humor in it. A pregnant woman with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Sarah swallowed hard, the weight of Margaret's words settling deep in her chest. She couldn't imagine. And yet, in some ways, she could. Because wasn't she just standing in the rain, ignored by the world, feeling like she didn't matter? Margaret continued. "The night I left that apartment, it was snowing. I had nothing but a small suitcase and a coat that wasn't nearly warm enough. I walked for hours, searching for shelter, knocking on doors, asking for help. And do you know what people did? They looked away. They shut their doors. They told me they couldn't help, that they were sorry, but not sorry enough to let me in. I was young, pregnant, freezing, and invisible to the world. I thought, this is it. This is how it ends for me and my baby." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She reached for her tea, though she wasn't sure if it was to warm her hands or steady her heart. "But someone helped you," she said softly. "That's why you're here. That's why you're telling me this." Margaret nodded slowly, her face softening. "Just when I had almost given up, when my legs were too tired to walk any farther, I found a small church with its lights still on. I hesitated at the door, too ashamed to go inside. I didn't want to be another burden, another problem for someone else to deal with. But then the door opened, and a woman stood there, looking at me the way I looked at you tonight. Like she saw me. Really saw me." Sarah wiped at her cheeks, realizing only then that she had started crying. "What did she do?" Margaret's eyes glowed with warmth. "She didn't ask me who I was. She didn't ask me how I got there or why I had nowhere to go. She just took my hand, led me inside, and wrapped a blanket around me. She made me tea just like I made for you. She let me sit in silence, let me breathe. And then she said, 'You're safe now.'" Margaret took a deep breath, her voice thick with emotion. "That woman, a stranger to me, gave me a place to stay. She and her husband let me sleep in their guest room, fed me, and made sure I saw a doctor. When my daughter was born months later, they were there, holding my hand through it all. They weren't rich. They weren't obligated. But they gave me the one thing no one else would. A chance. A chance to keep going. A chance to survive. And all they ever asked of me was to do the same for someone else when I could." Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed by the weight of Margaret's story. It wasn't just a story. It was a lesson, a torch passed down from one hand to another, from one act of kindness to the next. "And you have," Sarah whispered. "You helped me. Just like they helped you." Margaret reached across the table, squeezing Sarah's hand gently. "And one day you'll help someone too. Because that's how kindness works. It's not about grand gestures or wealth or fame. It's about seeing someone when the rest of the world looks away. It's about stopping when everyone else keeps walking. It's about remembering what it felt like to be cold, afraid, and alone, and making sure someone else doesn't have to feel that way." Sarah nodded, unable to find the words to express what she felt in that moment. Because it was more than gratitude. It was understanding. It was realization. It was a promise taking root in her heart, just as it had in Margaret's all those years ago. Margaret wasn't just telling her a story. She was giving her something far more valuable than shelter or warmth. She was giving her purpose. The bakery seemed quieter now, the rain outside a gentle hum against the windows. Margaret finished her tea, setting the cup down with a small smile. The world will always have its fair share of cold nights and closed doors. But as long as there are people willing to open them, just like that woman did for me, just like I did for you, kindness will never die. Sarah wiped at her eyes, feeling something shift inside her. She had thought tonight was about her being stranded in the rain. But now, she realized it was about so much more. It was about Margaret. It was about the woman before her. It was about a cycle of kindness, unbroken and ever-growing. And she vowed, with everything in her, that when the time came, she would be the one to stop. She would be the one to see. She would be the one to help. Because Margaret was right. Helping others was never a burden. It was a blessing. And now, it was her turn to pass it on. Margaret took Sarah's hands in her own, her touch warm despite the chill in the air. "Come now, dear, let's get you home," she said, her voice filled with the certainty of someone who had lived long enough to understand that the smallest gestures could change lives. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Margaret had already done so much, offering her shelter, warmth, and a listening ear. She didn't want to impose further. But Margaret's expression remained unwavering, as if she had already decided that tonight, Sarah was her responsibility, just as someone had once taken care of her. The two women stepped out into the night. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the air smelled of damp earth and freshly baked bread from Margaret's little bakery. Margaret guided Sarah toward an old but well-maintained car parked just outside. Sarah climbed in, grateful for the soft seat beneath her. The interior smelled of lavender and vanilla, and for the first time in hours, she let out a deep breath. She was safe. Margaret started the car, the engine humming softly. "Tell me about your husband," she said as they pulled onto the quiet road. The streetlights cast long shadows against the wet pavement. Sarah smiled, the thought of her husband filling her with warmth. "James," she said softly. "He's wonderful. A good man. He works so hard to take care of us. He must be worried sick right now." She glanced at the phone in her lap, relieved that she had been able to call him. Relief washed over her again, knowing that soon she would be home in his arms. Margaret nodded knowingly. Good men are a treasure. Hold on to him tight. Sarah turned to look at the elderly woman, curiosity flickering in her tired eyes. "Did you have someone?" she asked. Margaret's hands tightened slightly on the wheel, and for a moment, she said nothing. Then she let out a sigh, the kind that carried the weight of a lifetime. "I did," she said finally. "He was kind. He would have driven through a hurricane to get to me if I needed him. But life," she trailed off, shaking her head, "life doesn't always go the way we think it will." Sarah didn't press. She had learned tonight that some stories were meant to be told in their own time. They drove in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers against the glass. The city was quieter now, the storm having driven most people indoors. A few stragglers hurried along the sidewalks, their heads down, lost in their own worries. As they neared Sarah's neighborhood, Margaret glanced at her. "You remind me of myself," she said. "When I was young, I thought I had to do everything alone. I was too proud to ask for help, too afraid to be a burden. But kindness isn't about debt. It's not about owing someone. It's about giving because you can. Because someone once did it for you." Sarah swallowed past the lump in her throat. She had spent so much of her life trying to be independent, to prove she could handle things on her own. But tonight, standing alone in the rain, she had realized how deeply she had needed someone to stop. And Margaret had. The car slowed in front of Sarah's home. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow. She could see James standing at the window, his figure tense with worry. As Margaret put the car in park, Sarah turned to her, searching for the right words. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "I don't think I ever can." Margaret smiled, reaching over to pat her hand. "Then don't," she said simply. Just promise me one thing. Sarah nodded, willing to do anything for this woman who had been a stranger only hours ago but now felt like a guiding light. Anything. Margaret's eyes twinkled, full of both wisdom and mischief. When you see someone in need, be the one who stops. Sarah felt her breath catch. The weight of the words settled into her chest, not as a burden, but as a gift. A promise. A lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She opened the car door and stepped out, the cool night air wrapping around her. Before she closed the door, she turned back, tears in her eyes. I promise, she said, her voice unwavering. Margaret nodded, satisfied. Good girl. And with that, she drove away, disappearing into the night, leaving behind not just warmth, but the knowledge that kindness, real, selfless kindness, was never wasted. It only grew. And now, it was Sarah's turn to let it bloom. Sarah stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the taillights vanish into the rain. A part of her wanted to run after Margaret, to hold onto the warmth she had found in the old woman's presence, but another part of her knew that this was just the beginning of something bigger. She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the faint kick of life within her. One day, she would tell her daughter about this night, about the moment a stranger became an angel in disguise, about the night she learned that the smallest gestures could hold the most powerful meanings. Life moved on. The storm passed, the days grew longer, and soon, Sarah found herself in a hospital room, holding her newborn daughter in her arms. She named her Margaret, a silent tribute to the woman who had changed her life with nothing more than an open heart and a warm cup of tea. As she cradled her child, she couldn't help but wonder how many lives had been touched by that single act of kindness so many years ago. Had the person who once helped Margaret also been saved by a stranger? How far back did the chain go? And how far forward would it stretch now that Sarah was a part of it? Months later, on an ordinary afternoon, Sarah found herself rushing through a grocery store, juggling bags of baby formula and diapers while her daughter slept soundly in the stroller. The sky had darkened outside, heavy with the promise of another storm. As she stepped toward the exit, she noticed a young woman standing near the entrance, fumbling with her grocery bags, struggling to shield herself from the sudden downpour. She looked exhausted, her shoulders hunched in defeat, and something about the sight struck Sarah deep in her soul. She saw herself in that woman, drenched, desperate, waiting for someone to care. Without a second thought, Sarah shifted her bags onto one arm, grabbed an umbrella, and walked over. Here, let me help you, she said gently, holding the umbrella above the woman's head. The stranger looked up in surprise, her eyes wide with disbelief before softening into gratitude. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't think anyone would stop. Sarah smiled, a familiar warmth blooming in her chest. Someone once stopped for me, she said simply. And now it's my turn. As they walked together to the woman's car, Sarah felt a strange sense of completion, as if she were closing a circle that had begun long before she ever knew it existed. Maybe, one day, this woman would find herself in a similar moment, offering shelter to someone who needed it. Maybe, just maybe, kindness was something eternal, a seed planted in the hearts of those willing to nurture it, growing into something vast and unbreakable. As Sarah watched the woman drive away, she realized something profound. Margaret had not just given her a ride home that night. She had given her a purpose, a mission to carry forward. It wasn't about grand gestures or life-changing miracles. It was about the little things. A warm meal. A dry place to stand. A gentle hand on a shoulder. These were the things that made the world feel a little less cold, a little less lonely. And in a time where people often walked past each other without a second glance, choosing to stop, choosing to help, was an act of quiet revolution. As the first raindrops began to fall, Sarah pulled her daughter close, whispering a silent promise. She would teach her child the same lesson Margaret had taught her. She would raise her to believe that kindness was never wasted, that even the smallest act could ripple outward, touching lives in ways they could never predict. And so, the cycle continued. One woman, one stormy night, one act of compassion that would never fade. If you like this type of story, please like, share, subscribe, and support this channel.